So today we are doing the first half, two-thirds of Tzadi Dalid, which largely dedicated to spoons, as folks may have noticed. But we have a couple different genres of question that come up with our various spoons being accidentally or purposely stuck into pots. So what are some of the main factors or questions that come up across our halachot?
Ben Yomo Eno Ben Yomo.
Right. Ben yomo, eno ben yomo. Obviously, why is that relevant?
If it hasn't been used in 24 hours, then we're gonna, generally speaking, be more lenient, at least b'diavad.
Right, that we have this notion because if it hasn't been used in 24 hours, it'll be leaf gum, which also, importantly, since we're in Basar B'chalav land at this point, as opposed to just dealing with, oh, does something, is it usser flavor that has become pagam and therefore doesn't forbid things. We have this notion that if either the basar or chalav flavor by itself is pagam, then it doesn't make proper basar v'chalav when they combine, right? We only get the isser basar v'chalav if both of those independently are still, l'shavach. So amazing. The question of whether something is leaf gum, whether it's bat yoma or ena bat yoma comes up. What are some of the other factors that come up?
What does asur b'hana'ah mean? Is it very inclusive, or are there exceptions for that where you can actually continue to use the pot for certain purposes?
Yeah, there's a fun thing. Questions both about I think there are two different ways we'll see this show up. There's the question of what does Isur Hana'ah constitute? Like what is the Hana'ah that is forbidden? And then there's also a case where something doesn't become Asur B'Hana'ah because it didn't become properly Basar B'Chalav, but because it's sort of Basar B'Chalav, you can only use Parav in it. Right? So we'll see the question of like, oh, there are these pots that you can't cook anything in, but can you use them for something? Versus ones that you maybe just can't cook either, gendered food, as it were, inside. Josie?
So, what is it that may or may not be coming forbidden? Is it the meal? Is it the pot? Is it the spoon? What is becoming trafed up, to use the vernacular term?
Amazing, right? We have, like, again, these three main characters in a lot of our scenarios, the spoon, the pot, the food, although in some cases the water. And so the question is, like, what is the status of each of these, depending on, as Max already said, the question of which, if any of these things are ben yomo or eno ben yomo. Also the question of, is there shishim of the contents in the pot against the spoon? Related to the shishim, what's another question that we'll see at the very beginning here? How we're measuring.
Do we measure against the entire spoon or against what we think or what we know to be the isser that uh, is contained within that spoon?
Right. We have these debates as to how much of the volume of the spoon has to be counted against. And we'll see this as maybe relevant with particular to one type of material. So the first couple CFM are going to be around sort of measurement, right? There's the question of how much of the spoon we measure. And there's also the question of when you do it multiple times, there's this really interesting bit that we'll see. We won't have the time to do a super deep dive in, but the question of how sort of like yidiah, about how like knowledge of something happened, sort of switches its status such that we say something has already been nullified and now you just need 60 against a new amount versus when does it just keep multiplying the amount, the ratio that you need against your spoon. Um, and then the last thing, this is something that I will apologize in that I imagine it's a little confusing for those who have not done uh, not bar not before because the way we're structured it, noten tam bar notin tam, the sort of like main sugya on it, or the main siman on it is after this. And so despite the fact that it's after this, the concept comes up very prominently, as you've already seen in many of our simanim, but it features very heavily in the last couple of theme today. So this idea of what happens when permissible flavors get like watered down or weakened as they're passed on, and at what point does that stop rendering things prohibited? So that is going to be a big feature. We will talk about it a lot today, but also hopefully will mean there's even more clarity when you get to finally talking about the fish very soon. But for now, we're going to start in the Torah. So beginning with Aleph in the Torah. Shammai, do you want to read for us?
Sure. So, סימן א', הסוחב כף חולבת בגזרה של בשר, או איפכה, ושערינן בכל מה שסחב ממנה בגזרה, ולא ידעינן כמה נפק מינה. So if we put a spoon, a dairy spoon in a meat pot, or vice versa, so in terms of the 60 times what? We do 60 times the part of the spoon that was submerged. Not how much part of the spoon was actually previously touching meat or milk, but how much was inside the pot or in the stew, I guess. Because assuming the part of the spoon that was inside the stew, only there was emission. And what remained outside of the stew, so it's outside, it cannot touch the stew. והרב רבי פרץ כתב, שאם הכף של מתכת משערים בכולה, אף מה שלא נכנס ממנה בגדרה, משום חם מקצתו, חם כולו. So there's an exception that Rabbi Peretz mentions, that he quotes from Rabbi Peretz, that a metal spoon, there's a bit exception. It's more machmir because you count even the part that's outside the stew, since it has a special characteristic that he calls, if part of it is hot, then all of it is hot, which I understand to mean that the flavor outside the pot, outside the stew, let's say, can still be transmitted into the food in the stew because it's a hot metal object.
Well, right. So this will be actually the kind of point of dispute, which is that everyone actually agrees with the concept of cham miksato cham kulo, because that comes up in a sugya on psachim. The idea that metal, essentially is saying metal conducts heat, right? Like everyone agrees there's an acknowledgement that like metal functions differently than, say, a wooden spoon. And so you heat part of the metal, the rest of it's heated. What we'll see in the Beit Yosef, I think, is going to put this pretty well, is the question of, does the fact that the entire metal gets heated necessarily have to map onto how much of the spoon we measure? So Shammai, can you read the Beit Yosef on Aleph?
Yeah. So the Beit Yosef says, כלומר, הדבעינן לשיעורי בכל מה שצחב ממנה ולא סגל לשיעורי בטעם בשר הבלוע במה שצחב ממנה ונפלט לתוך החלב או איפכה. So why is it that we are measuring against all of the part of the spoon that's submerged and not just the part that we know has previously touched meat or milk? היינו תמה משום דלא ידעינן כמה נפיק מינה. Because we don't know actually how much how much flavor was emitted. הילקח בעינא לשיעורי בכל מה שזכב ממנה. And that's why we measure against the entire portion of the spoon that's submerged. ומיהו היכא שידוע כמה בלעה, כגון שהייתה חדשה וניער בה כזית חלב, ואחר כך תחבה בגדירה בשר או איפכה, כיוון שידוע שלא הייתה בלועה אלא מכזית, אין צריך לשער אלא בכזית. So all what we had previously said is only because we don't know. But if we know that only a kazait of spoon touched let's say the milk, and it's a new spoon.
I think it's the opposite. The new spoon has only ever been used to stir a kazait of milk, right? So a kazait's worth of milk is the maximum amount that this spoon could possibly have in it.
Okay. But is it spread over all the... Like my question is it spread... so you cook the kazait, But do you know when he talks about knowing, you don't know which part of the spoon cooked the kazait, right?
Well, the assumption is that you, at least the bottom part of the spoon is assumed to have generally come in contact with the kazait. I think what's hard is we have kind of two separate but overlapping questions here. One is like, how do we measure based off of like our assumption of what is balua and what is nafak? And the other is how much of the spoon do we measure based off of what is stirring it now? So the first part that the Shulchan Aruch is clarifying, like the Beis Yosef is just saying, ultimately, in contrast to sort of Ravid he'll mention in a bit in the Bedek HaBayit, he's like, we don't know how much, the exact amount that the spoon is emitting, right? If this much of the spoon is immersed in the soup, it's possible that less than this much milk emerged from it, but I don't know. And so the first opinion says I have to assume that this much milk emerged from it, right? The volume of however much of the spoon was in the soup or the whatever, the meat dish. I have to assume that that is the volume of milk that was expelled because that is the maximum volume of milk that could have been expelled. So before we get to the Rabbeinu Peretz consideration, the original opinion seems to be assuming that the most that could be expelled is the volume of what is specifically stuck into the soup. And we don't know. It could be less than that, but since we have no way of knowing generally, we assume it is that amount. The exception being, if I just got this spoon today and I stirred a tiny little bit of milk with it, then that tiny little bit of milk is the absolute maximum amount of milk that could possibly be in this spoon anywhere. So that's like our ceiling of how much we could have to measure against in that case, right? So that's all within the framework of assuming that only what's stuck into the dish is what we're measuring against. But then he adds, וסבר הזו,
וסבר הזאת זה לא מצליח לשער, אלא במה שתחב ממנה, ולא מפלגה בין של עץ לשל מתכת. וסברת רבנו פרץ זה מצריך בשל מתכת לשער בכולו, משום דכלי מתכת חם מקצתו, חם כולו. שתיהן כתב סמק בסימן רי"ג. So he's basically he's quoting the two opinions, the first opinion and then the Rabbeinu Peretz. אבל בשער יורא כתב סתם כסברה ראשונה, ונותן טעם, is that like a play on words?
No, maybe, but gives the rationale.
Pun intended, okay. ונותן טעם, דאף על פי שחם מקצתו, חם כולו, מכל מקום לא אמרינן דהוליך בליעתו. וכן נראה שהוא דעת בעל התרומה, וגם ממה שכתב סמק בסימן ר"ה, אין ראיה דהתם הגעת רבנו פרץ היא. ולטעמי הזיל, כמו שיכתוב בסוף סימן זה. So he's saying that, he's quoting the Shari Dura, that he supports the first opinion brought by the Torah against Rabbeinu Peretz, that we don't make this exception for the metal spoon.
And what's the logic?
So even if we say cham miksato cham kulo, it's still not enough to transmit flavor. Basically.
Exactly. Right? That the opinion that's not Rabbeinu Peretz's says, like I said, everyone seems to agree that cham miksato cham kulo is a principle. The question is just whether that's applicable to our question of how much we measure against. They're like, maybe the handle of the spoon's getting hot. That doesn't necessarily mean like that doesn't have to be synonymous with the assumption that whatever is absorbed in the handle of the spoon is being conveyed into the soup. Right? It's the question like, do we think heat conduction and flavor kind of dispersion, as it were, necessarily go together or not? And so he's also pointing out that there's a lot of other folks who seem to hold not like Rabbeinu Peretz, right? We have a lot of other opinions that either explicitly rule against him or certainly don't necessarily rule like him. The last bit here is also just a kind of fun aside where the Beis Yosef mentions a data yachid of the Ravid, where the Ravid says that with non cheres vessels that you actually don't have to measure against all of the vessel itself. You just like make a generous estimate of how much you think was expelled. But the Ramban sort of tears him to shreds and says, how do you know that? Like, what do you mean make a generous estimate? Unless you know, again, like the case here where you know specifically the only thing it ever stirred, like, how are you supposed to be measuring how much this thing absorbed and expelled? He's like, we don't have any clear way of knowing that. And so going by the volume of the Kli is the only tool at our disposal, which I think is a fair criticism, even though the Ravid is clearly expressing some measure of maybe discomfort with this notion that we always default to like the maximum possible volume, which probably is not what's usually being expelled in flavor particle, as it were. Rev Joel.
I was wondering about this because right, how do we know man the fakmine is really about the udder, right? That's where we get the quote in the Gemara, which is about food. And kalim, right, we've seen this is like we can't quite decide are kalim like ochel or are they different from ochel? And so you can imagine that okay, for like what comes out of food, we're going to be machmir about, but maybe not kalim. That's like my defense of the Ramban, but I understand the Ramban. Of course, it's
No, I think the
yeah.
Rabbit again, like I think the Rabbit is very reasonable, like pushback against this kind of in some ways like a Chumrah creep, which is that like, okay, well, we don't really know how much came out, so we have to always go by the absolute maximum possible amount it could theoretically be, which, as Rev Joel pointed out, is like even more of a stretch when we're dealing with something that just has like absorbed flavor in a vessel and isn't even an actual piece of food itself. And on the other hand, the Ramban's retort is like, okay, maybe it's chumrdik, but like, what's the alternative? Like, you're saying we don't need to go by that chumrah, but you don't have actually like a really concrete alternative suggestion of what that looks like. Okay. For our next one, we're going to briefly glance, if people have the document, I can share it again in the chat here. We're going to look at this Mishnah and the Bartanura on it real quick. So, Isaac, do you want to read the Mishnah and Trumot for us?
No, thank you, because my migraine is getting much worse. Sorry.
No worries at all. Max, do you want to read it?
Sure. Seya truma shenafla lamea velo hispik lahagbia ad shenafla acheres harezo asura v'Rabbi Shimon matir. So if one unit of truma falls into 100 of chulin, and you didn't get a chance to remove that truma, and then another one fell in, the what would have previously been bittul doesn't work. The mixture is usher, according to the Chachamim, but Rabbi Shimon is matir.
Amazing. So the Chachamim see this as like now you have two pieces of truma in 100 pieces of chulin, and that's not a measure of bitul. But Rabbi Shimon clearly thinks some measure of bitul did happen. So look at the Bartanura on this for Rabbi Shimon matir.
Rabbi Shimon matir, kishelo noda lo nefila rishona ad shenafla shniya, mo de Rabbi Shimon de kaman de naflu b'vas achas dami. So if you didn't know about the first drop until the second one happened, then Rabbi Shimon would be modeh that that's just 2 in 100 and that's no good. Ki palig heicha denoda ala b'intayim velo ispik laharim ad shenafla acheres. But he disagrees in a case where you did know in between and you just didn't have a chance to remove it in time. Rabbi Shimon Savar kevan Savar kevan de omed laharim kimuram dami. That once it is ready to be taken out, that we treat it as if it's already been taken out. Meaning, if there's Yediyah bein taim, then either you don't have to actually take it out, or b'di'eved after it counts as bittul. Ve'az de l'ta'ameh de'islei ba'alma kol ha'omed lizarek kezaruk dami. And he has a similar opinion about zrika. V'chachamim omrim hashda mihas lo hurma. V'halacha kechachamim. But the Chachamim say, look, at the end of the day, you didn't remove it. It's still there. That's 2 and 100. There's no bittul.
Hmm. Amazing. Right. So this is again like we have, and he adds the as like the chamim.
Yeah.
That there's this broader principle that Rabbi Shimon has that shows up a lot in Kodshim, right? Which is that like, this notion of like once something is like prepared, the blood is prepared to have been sprinkled, in certain contexts, we can act as if it already has been, right? This notion that like, and this comes up in a couple contexts, the idea that like something which has been sort of prepared, acknowledged, this idea that basically preparation and awareness can affect like, a halachic metaphysical reality, as it were. The Rishon says like, even though you didn't take the truma out, you saw it, you thought, wow, that's one piece of truma that fell into 100 chulin. I'm going to remove some truma, and also that's a shear of bitul, and that it happened. And as soon as you notice that, you now have 101 pieces of chulin in front of you. So when the second one falls, there's a shear of beetle. Whereas the chachamim, the assumption here is that they think even if you noticed that it happened, we actually still think that when another piece of truma falls in, you have 2 pieces of truma to 100 pieces of chulin, and that's not the requisite ratio. So this is sort of referenced as the relevant background for our next halacha, although we will see there are some relevant distinctions as well. So Max, do you want to read bet in the Torah?
Yeah. V'im tzachal hakaf b'kdera shtei pa'amim, v'lo noda b'intayim tzarich shtei pa'amim shishim. If you stuck the spoon into the kedera twice and you didn't know that it was the wrong type of spoon in the meantime, then you need 60 times 2.
Amazing. Look at the Beis Yosef, the bet Aleph here.
The nireh.
Yes, Nira Shatam.
Okay, nireh she'atam mipnei she'im noda b'intayim bechad zimna shishim bechad zimna shishim sagi debesha shenoda kvar nispatel iser b'shishim ukshechazar v'tachav pam shniya b'shishim batelhu be'osam hashishim ve'af ha'isr shenafal b'tchila mitzaref im haheter la'alos es ha'isr shenafal shenis. Okay, so the reason why I guess the reason why Yediyah is a factor here is that if you knew at first, after the first time you stuck the spoon in, then right. If you knew first, then it would wait. Just got lost. Should know that in time, but if you knew in between, then the bittul already happened with
Right, and
after the first time you stuck the spoon in.
exactly. And there's this notion that we see elsewhere, he quotes this thing about like orla malet akilaim, akilaim, it's orla, basically the idea. I mean, there it's also actually talking about maybe something that's already iser, but that can combine because it's a different type of thing. But here he's like, yeah, once the beetle has happened, then all you have is now like 61 or, if your parts heter to the next time the spoon gets dipped in. We'll see that not everyone agrees with this take about the tzarich shtei pa'amim shishim. What are things that are different about our spoon case than the truma one?
I mean, with
Right.
the truma one, it sounds like it's more accidental. Oops, all truma. Oops, I dropped it in twice. But with the spoon, it's not accidental. It's sort of, I don't want to call it negligence, but you're just not paying attention. You're just not, you weren't paying attention,
It's an interesting
right?
distinction. I feel like, yeah, I mean, I think you could argue either way. You could say that not picking up the piece of truma that fell in when you noticed between is negligent, that you should have, like, snatched it as soon as you noticed. But it is true that we're dealing with a different reality of like, oh, you weren't even paying attention to what is in front of you, right? With the spoon, they're just like absent-mindedly dipping it in, not paying attention to what genre of spoon it is. I saw Rav Joel, Reuven.
Is it me first?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. I think the substance is totally different in the sense that asea, there's this idea that it could be huram, like you could just lift it up. But with the spoon and what might adhere to the spoon and balua and like that whole conversation, that seems very different.
Yeah, the physical realities are really different, right? Part of it is like the truma is a yavesh b'yavesh case that we're dealing with. It's about all these like discrete units, as opposed to, as you mentioned, here we're dealing with cases of balua, what's absorbed. There's also hanan. We'll see people mention that comes up. Um, and also, like something other people point out is that, like with the truma, right? Because part of the argument used for like the opinion that you certainly need to here is they're like in the truma, as Bartonura said, everyone agrees that if you didn't notice between the falling, even Rabbi Shimon would say that, like, it's not batel. Right? So everyone would agree here that if you don't notice between the two spoon dippings, that like both Rabbi Shimon and the Chachamim would say you need like 120 parts. But the difference, some folks point out, is that in the case of the truma, you materially have more truma, right? Like when an extra thing of truma has fallen in, there is now just, volume wise, double the amount of truma that existed. Whereas here, there's no new substances being added. And the question is going to largely depend on how we understand Hanan and spoons. Rav Joel?
Well, that's the two things. One, I mean, it could be, like the question is, what is being added? Is it it could be a new Easter, right? Which we'll see, right? We'll see this in some things, but a new Easter is now going in the second time. The first Easter, it wasn't an Easter. It was like, was it, I can't remember which case we've got is Kaf 11. So it's milk going into meat. And the second time it's milk and meat going into milk and meat or something like that. That's what I mean by new Easter. But the second question, of course, is in the spoon potentially in some views could get weakened each time, right? Kind of like what we saw with the Bali Tour, maybe a little bit less with the Rashba, but more with the Bali Tour versus the Truma. The second part of Truma is literally a second thing of Truma. Nothing's getting weakened with each dipping.
Yeah, this is something that the Bach, we don't have time to do. You can see there's a very long Bach on this that we sadly will not get to dive into, but he essentially ends up concluding that we should hold like Rabbeinu Peretz for Shari Surim, but that for Basar B'chalav, you shouldn't because of this notion of like Niklash HaIsor, that the Isser is like kind of weakened in these processes. Okay. We will see a bit more in our Nosei Kelim on the Shulchan Aruch. I think the Shach will do a good job of explaining some of the kind of logic of the Balua Hanan debates that come up. Rav Nachum?
Yeah, we learned before about the concept of Choser v'Nior, which means that in like even the Noda Beintayim, why does that help? He says, well, it's Batel, and you knew it was Batel, but we do have a concept of Choser v'Nior, which means presumably even if it was Batel, you knew about it. When more of that same Isser starts adding, they join together, Isser Matzah et Chavero, whatever. They find each other, and now you have two. And like you said, substantively, I have more stuff. So it should not be batal. The idea of bittul is not really a permanent bittul. It's more of waiting and seeing until maybe some more Isser came in.
Well, but I would say that's actually part of related to the distinction I made about like the sort of volume of things that are changing. That is a distinction that actually I think maybe the Roche makes. There's a couple folks who talk about this where they say Yeah, like in other cases, or like the wine dripping or things like that, we're talking about like literally there is more of that isser. Like there is now more of that thing, such that like,
Yeah.
yeah, like there is more
But
of that
in the
flavor.
Truma case, there is more of that thing.
Right. Although in the Truma case, there's other factors such as like the idea of like Yavish Biyavish being Batel Berov Deoraita, and also the possibility of maybe being able to lift the thing out, the like Maspik Harim, even if you do it afterwards. So there's other factors that make the Truma case a little, in some ways, more flexible. But when it comes to when we talk about Choser V'Neor in like absorbed, like in a big not Yavish Biyavish case, a distinction that some people make is that there's a difference between, oh, like there was some bacon juice that fell into my soup and it got bottled because there was, 60 times that amount of bacon juice. And then more bacon juice just keeps falling into my soup. And now I just have more bacon flavor in there. And it becomes much harder to like use the sort of legal fiction to say all of the other bacon juice has become kosher soup. At some point, you just have a lot of bacon in there. Whereas here, as Rav Joel pointed out, there are people who are talking about this notion of conceptually a new Isser maybe forms if we believe that Hanan can happen in Kalim. But the amount of meat and milk you have doesn't change. If this spoon hasn't gone anywhere else in between, there's actually no additional milk flavor that's going into it. And so they point out, I think it's a smart distinction, being like, oh, Jose Reneor makes a lot of sense when we're talking about there is literally more flavor of this Isser going in, as opposed to it will be much more of like a sort of conceptual distinction, kind of detached from the reality if we apply that here, when actually the ratio of flavors remains the same. Okay. We will see more. We'll talk about how the sort of Balua thing plays out. But for now, let's take a peek. We've talked a bit about how we're measuring our shishim, but now we're going to talk, as we mentioned at the beginning, about the status of our different kalim and food. So, Josie, do you want to read Gimel in the Torah?
Sure. ואם יש 60 לבטל הכף גדרה והתבשיל, והכף הגדרה והתבשיל מותרים. אבל הכף אסורה בין אם בשר בין אם חלב, לפי שהיא בלועה מבשר וחלב. ואפילו בדיעבד אוסרת אם חזרו ותחווה בין בבשר וחלב, כל זמן שהיא בת יומה, ואם אין לו 60 הכל אסור, והנאה אפילו הקדרה. Keep going. אך מותר לתת לתוכו פירות או צונן, כיוון שאינו נהנה מגוף האיסור.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to talk about if there's 60 against the spoon, and I guess we're working in the world of just the part of the spoon that went in. The pot and the dish, the food, are both permitted, but the spoon is no longer permitted, whether it was with meat or with milk, because it now has it's a meaty, milky spoon, right?
Right. There's this notion of like the spoon, the spoon expelled its milk into the dish, and the dish nullified that milk. And so that's all fine. But in expelling that milk, we can't assume that all of the milk was expelled, and it absorbed some of the meat of the dish. So our spoon is not kosher, and therefore, if b'diavad even
and even afterwards, and if you and then if you pick it out and put it in a second time, either with meat or with milk, whenever it's bat yoma, if there's not shishim against the spoon, now we've got a meaty, milky spoon in anything. Everything is asur, asur bahana, because now you've got meaty, milky. Even the pot itself. So now we've trafed everything in the vernacular.
right.
But it is permitted to put it into fruit or something cold, because when you do that, it's not benefiting from the guf ha'isur, the meaty milky.
Right. This is going back to what Shammai had mentioned earlier, this notion of like how do we understand what it means to be like when something's asur bahana, then and we'll get in the Taz gets into this a little bit more as well, but like do we just say because the Kedera has become asur bahana, any usage of it whatsoever is forbidden? Or is it that you can't benefit from anything where that flavor would be present or where you're using it meaningfully as a Kadera. But like sticking some fruit in the Kadera is not benefiting from its basar v'chalab status, right? That fruit is sitting in the pot, same as if it had nothing else absorbed in it. So we'll see there's debates as to how far we can sort of stretch that logic. But Josie, can you read the Beit Yosef, the Gimel Aleph, v'katav od b'smak?
וכתב בסמק, יש לתמוע כשהכף בת יומא ויש 60 מן הכף דאמרינן לקדרה מותרת והכף אסורה בין אם בשר בין אם חלב. So this is there's reason here to be a little bit surprised when the spoon is we know it's bat yoma, and if there's 60 against it, that we say that everything is okay except the spoon is forbidden, whether it's meat or milk. And ולמה כיוון שיש 60 בגדרה מן הכף, אם כן יחשב לכך שהגלה מבליעה ראשונה. So if that's the case, why don't we consider the spoon as if it's done hagala? And it's sort of like spit it all out at the first time. V'hiyela din kedera atzma im basar im chalav chalav. So the idea here is why aren't we actually koshering the spoon when we dip it in our stew?
It's similar to our Bal HaItzvor thing that we said, where you're like, okay, you had a chalavi spoon, but the chalavi spoon gets dipped in this boiling meat pot that has shishim to batel the chalav. Why don't we say the chalav is expelled, it's batel, and it's absorbed meat, and now it's just a bisari spoon. So why can't we say that? Yesh lomar.
Yesh lomar dilma dilma ate lemute atu. Then maybe there's a little bit left. Didn't it? We just mentioned this earlier. Maybe it doesn't expel all of it, and there's a little bit left.
Dilma ate lemitai, that someone might come to make a mistake.
I'm sorry, dilma ate. Oh, yes. Sorry, dyslexia strikes again. Dimitai atu atehedolo nitchava hakaf kedera.
Ki'im.
Ki'im miktzata. Ve'od hagala ena mo'elet. So because you might make this mistake, and here the hagala wouldn't be effective. Dafka berotachim, even if it were rotachim kolkach.
So it's only the ki'im is like unless, right? So we have two unlesses here. One is that like someone might come to think because the fact is this has come to air. I think realistically, probably almost whenever you're using a spoon to dip and not actually trying to kosher it, you're not actually putting the entire spoon in the soup, right? Probably part of it you're holding purposefully. And so he's like, theoretically, if the whole spoon fully went in it, that could be Hagala. But most of the time, the whole spoon isn't going in. And so that wouldn't be kosher, like that wouldn't kosher it. So that's one problem. And the other is that Hagala only works when it's boiling, right? Dafka berotchin kol kach.
Shema alin reticha ule'inyan hitzrach shishim afilu she'ena mo'elet reticha.
Afilu she'ena mo'elet reticha.
Rak she'tehei rotachat she'yat soledet boba.
Okay.
ועוד דמספק רתיחה מצריכין 60 והגלה אינה מועלת. Right? So we might have the case where I'm sorry, ki'im ודאי רותחת.
Okay.
ועוד אנו מצריכים 60 מכל הכף. אפילו בספק תחיבת כולה, והעגלה אינה מועלת כי אם בוודאי תחיבה כולה עד כאן לשנה. Right, so the smock is writing, finishing up his response saying, you'd still have to dip the whole spoon in, and it would have to stay boiling for all of this. And you still need shishim against the whole spoon to actually make this all work. So there's a lot of there's a lot of if and unless coming off your plan here.
Yeah, he's basically saying, and this is again to note, like also ends up saying this disagrees with the Rashba, but I'm not actually fully convinced that it does disagree with the Rashba, right? Because he's actually not seemingly disagreeing in principle. That he's like, theoretically, if I had a totally, I mean, you couldn't do this lechatchila because whatever. Actually, okay, this is kind of complicated, but I had a really high boiling meat stew and my dairy spoon got fully dropped, the entirety of it, into the, high boil meat stew. He's saying that that had shishim times the amount of that spoon. He's saying it would work. He's saying that if you actually did that, the full spoon went into this boiling meat stew and there's shishim times the spoon would be, now bisari. But the reason that we don't default to saying in these cases where, the spoon got dipped in and there's shishim, that the spoon is just bisari, is because A, probably not all of the spoon did go in. B, we require B-tool even when there isn't like a roiling boil, right? Even when it's just hot enough that it's uncomfortable to touch, you still need B-tool, but that level of heat does not perform Hagala successfully, right? So he's saying there are various contexts in which we might require shishim against all of the spoon that wouldn't necessarily mean the spoon itself would be effectively koshered. So it's like, even though there's a theoretical in which that could work, because most of the time you're not going to be meeting that theoretical, we default to saying that the spoon is usser. Okay. Um, Now let's see, Rav Joel.
I was just going to say, I think he cites the Rabbeinu Yerucham here too, right? Which is the idea that the Rashba may only think that this actually works, that it only weakens the flavor if you're doing a parv thing and not if you're
Right.
actually
That
doing
he's
it
like,
in
maybe it's the Yerakot, but he doesn't agree with Bala Itor, that like meat could be maklish, milk, etc.
yeah.
Exactly. Um, there's also another thing, just the Beis Yosef like briefly comments in the bit about using it for fruit, and he says it's not even just a davar yavesh, it seems like even a davar lach, which we've seen that there's a little bit more stringency around that because we think it interacts with the kind of surface more is still permitted. Um, because he says here the Shari Dora writes a reason. כתבתהו הדין לדבר שאינו צורך אכילה, ואפילו חמין כגון מים לרחוץ ראשו, דשארי, right? That the Shari Dora, and we'll see the Taz cite this, also says like if you want to boil some water to shampoo with, that's also fine, right? Because the main issue is you're not supposed to benefit in achila, in consumption from basar v'chalav. But he says you're not doing that if you're boiling water in the basar v'chalav pot to wash your hair with. Okay. Um, Now we're going to look at Kalev.
I remember somewhere where we talked about the ashes from the stove being
Mhm.
busted with olive, and you couldn't use those in a shampoo. Um, but that is not achila. Am I misremembering or?
Well, so if you remember, the Ramah mentioned that's a minhag, and then he's like, but there's no real basis, right? The Ramah listed that as one of many minhagim that the people had adopted, but then for this very reason was like, you don't really need to worry about this. You can use the Suffolk basar v'chalav ashes for your shampoo if you want to. But Caleb, do you want to read Dalit in the Torah for us?
ואם אין הכף בת יומם, הגדרה והתבשיל מותרים, והכף אסרם, לכתחילה בין אם בשר בין אם חלב, ומכל מקום בדיעבד אינה אסרת, כיוון שלא הייתה בת יומא. And if it and if the spoon was not used within the past 24 hours, then the pot and the food itself would be kosher, would be mutar, and the spoon would initially be forbidden, whether it was basari or chalavim. But after the fact, like in a yeah, it wouldn't necessarily be forbidden because it wasn't used within the past 24 hours.
Right. Look at the Beit Yosef, the Mashkatav Mikol Makom B'diavad Eina Oseret. Actually, sorry, apologies, before we get that, we're going to read the very beginning of the Beis Yosef, starting on Daled Mashkatav Rabbeinu V'im Ein Hakaf Bat Yoma, V'im Tomar.
I'm not seeing that. Let me find it.
Are you on the Al HaTorah or in the Shirat Devorah?
Sure, Devorah.
So the Beis Yosef, this one, it's at the very top of the page, like top right, Daled Mashkatav Rabbeinu V'im Ein Hakaf Bat Yoma.
Okay. V'im Tamar ma bein Kedera lekav hare gam hagadera be'ulam mebasar b'chalav. And if you say, what's the difference between the pot and the spoon? Since the pot also absorbed basar b'chalav flavor. V'mai tama sharit la mipnei shatam hachalav shabahu pugam chaf. Nami tam chalav shabohu pugam. And what is the reason? Is because the flavor of the chalav is pugam, and so also the flavor of the chalav is pugam in both the kadera and the kaf. The Yesh Lamar.
In your own words, what's the challenge that Beis Yosef is raising to the dean here? The sort of logical issue?
Is that we're saying that the Kedera would be mutar. The Torah is saying that the Kedera would be mutar, but the Kaf would be asar. And he's asking why there would be a difference in the Deen, considering that both the Kaf is Eno ben Yomo, and the taste within the Kaf would be Pugam. Um,
Right. The fact is they both have the same mixture of flavors, right? When you dip the Eno Ben Yomo Chalavi Kaf into the, pot that's cooking meat, the pot has Ben Yomo meat flavor and Eno Ben Yomo, Chalav flavor, and vice versa for the spoon. So why is the pot fine and the spoon isn't okay? So Yesh Lamar.
ויש לנו לכך שינה שבלעה החלב בשעת שבחו, הלכך אף לאחר שנפגם אסור כדין כלי שאינו ביומא, שאסור לבשל בו לכתחילה. And what is this, Rosh Tevot?
Ma she'en ken.
Moshe Inkin Bikadera Shalo Ba'ala Tam Hachalav Allah Akar She Nifgam Shari Kishe Nidchav Hachaf Bikadera Lohaya Ben Yomo Hilchak Shari Vikyotze Bazeh Akadvu Tosfot.
Okay.
Okay, so the Chaf did not absorb the or the time that the Chaf absorbed the Chalavi was not beneficial, like a beneficial flavor. Therefore, afterwards, when it was Pugam,
Or it's saying the kaf, right, absorbed the flavor at the time that like when the kaf initially had this milky flavor, it was real good milky flavor. It was proper milk, right? And it's just that like after, therefore, after some time, even though after a day or more, that milk has become, tam lifgam, it's still usser when it absorbs the shevach meat flavor.
Okay. And and that's different from the Cadera that only absorbed the dairy flavor after it had become nifgam. Um, and that was when the kaf was put into the Cadera. Um, and so that's the difference between why we're treating the um, two dens.
Right. Ultimately, they're saying the difference is that the kaf has at some point had both proper milk flavor and proper meat flavor. It's true that by the time it absorbed the proper meat flavor, the milk was leaf gum. But this had become a properly chalavi spoon that had absorbed actual leshevach milk flavor and ends up then absorbing real meat flavor. Whereas the Kadera, by the time the milk came into it, it was already like pagum, right? It has never had like milk flavor that was considered to be real substantive milk flavor with the power to oser. So even though like Lamaisa right now, the Kaf and the Kadera have the same combo of like, leaf gum milk flavor and the shevach meat flavor, because that milk flavor used to be actual substantive positive tasting milk flavor in the spoon, we're more strict there than with the pot, which never actually substantively absorbed quote unquote real milk flavor. Okay. The Beis Yosef also just points out in the Mashkatav bit that when it says, you're not supposed to use the kaf, but like b'diavad, it doesn't prohibit. He's like, to be clear, that's referring to like when you stick it again in the same type of food as the one you just stuck it into, right? If I had my Eno Ben Yomo milk spoon and I stick it into a meat stew, I'm not supposed to use it at all. But he's like, if I then stuck it into another meat stew, it would be fine. But he's like, to be clear, if I then stuck that into a milk dish, it just absorbed Ben Yomo meat flavor. That would actually very much be a problem. So he's just saying, like, if you stuck it again into the type of dish that it has today been stuck into, it wouldn't forbid it. Okay. Of Joel.
I just want to add, because we kind of started down this line last week and I didn't go too into it, the Tosfot theory of koshering. Like, why does it work if I boil water in something that's sat for 24 hours first and has only tam pagum in it? Wait a second. It's like tam pagum comes out of the water and goes back in. No one is not bar not, but another theory of going on there is potentially, well, it lost the flavor that absorbed bishvach, and now it got only flavor it got in its pagum state. The pikima didn't happen in the walls of the pot itself. And that makes a difference, kind of our theories of how dangerous things are.
Right. The
Could
difference
also
between something having absorbed flavor become leaf gum versus only ever absorbing leaf gum flavor.
it could also be that Tosfos is thinking that you're kidem v'salko. In other words, you took it out before it absorbed back again.
I
Right.
think
That
that,
it just
that shows up in some of them. Yeah.
right. But the idea of it's going to just be expelling what's currently in it. But then again, if you remember, there's the Rabbeinu Tam thing where he's like, I don't think that K'nei V'Sel Coat means that it's not absorbing anything. He's like, I think it means that it's expelling what's currently in it and it's absorbing, and it's just not expelling what it's currently absorbing until you take it off, which wouldn't solve our problem necessarily. But
Okay.
it is one of the logics. Okay, we're going to look at Hay in the Beit Yosef, which does not appear in the Torah, but will be the subject of a very, very lengthy shach that we will read some of. So, Reuven, do you want to read Hay in the Beit Yosef?
Yes, just give me one moment. I'm on Al HaTorah, so let's see. Is that beginning with
Im
מה
bishlu.
שכתב ומכל מקום?
No, this is im
No.
bishlu mayim. So that should be below that.
Yeah. אם בישלו במים?
Im bishlu mayim bakdera chadasha.
Great, I am here. Okay, thank you. אם בישלו במים בקדרה חדשה, ותחבו בה כף חולבת, ואחר כך חזרו ובישלו במים פעם אחרת, ותחבו בה כף של בשר, ושתי הכפות היו בני יומן, ובשום אחד מן הפעמיים לא היה במים 60, כתב סמק, סימן ר"ד, שאסור להשתמש בקדרה, לא בשר ולא חלב, אבל שאר דברים מותר לבשל בה, מאחר שהייתה חדשה שלא בישלו בה חלב מעולם. Okay, this is a very long sentence. Okay. If you cooked something, if you boiled something in water in a new kedera, and then you dipped a chalavi kaf in that kedera, and then afterwards you cooked something different, and then you stuck in a separate spoon that was a basari spoon. But were you cooking two different meals?
No, this is water, right? So I
This
heat
is
water in a
right.
new pot. I stick my milky spoon in it. At some other point, I boil water again and stick a meaty spoon in it.
And there was not shishim in either of those cases. Then the smak rules that you cannot use that kedera for, well, I shouldn't say. You can't use it for either basar or chalav. But for anything else, for example, maybe boiling some vegetables, perhaps, it's fine. Because yeah, it's a new kedera, and yeah, you were just boiling water in it in between. There was no chalav ever cooked inside of it.
Right. So we're dealing here again. There's like in this pot, we've never had any actual substantive direct milk or meat being cooked. It's just water that a milky spoon touched, and then water that a meaty spoon touched. In both cases, there was not enough to batel the spoon, right? But ultimately, so you can't cook meat or dairy because it's absorbed both meat and dairy flavor, right? And so therefore, we don't want it to expel that into either of those genres. But since, we end up saying, so you can't use meat or dairy. But the other things you can have, because it doesn't actually have proper basar v'chalav in it, right? They don't think that actually the walls of the pot, due to the various levels of distance, have become absorbed basar v'chalav that would be expelled into parve food, right? So parve food you can use, just no meat or dairy. That is the ruling from the smak, or at least as the Beit Yosef understands it. That could be a controversial point. And then do you want to read just the first part of this vav in the Torah, katav b'sefer truma?
Yes. Okay. Katav b'sefer hatrumot af al gav de b'sha'ar yisurim kedera shel isor shehayta me shehata me'ed leit below isor. Im huchmu ba chamin betoch me'ed leit chashiva kabat yoma. שהרי טעם איסור שבקדרה פלט לתוך המים, ולא היו בהן שישים לבטלה, דבכולה משערינן, ונעשית בת יומא, וצריכה מעת לעת, לאחר חימום המים, בבשר בחלב, where should I pause? אינו כן, then we get to a new clause. Should I keep going?
I mean, it goes on for a while, but you can translate what you've read.
Okay, I'll pause there. Okay, so the Sefer Trumot's opinion. Right. Okay, so even though for all other isurim, And when we're dealing with a kedera shel isor that rested for 24 hours, we'll say, with no isor inside of it, if you heated hot water inside of it for, well, betoch me'ed le'ed, within that, that's what I was confused about the chronology here. If you heated hot water within this kedera shel isor within that 24-hour resting period.
Right. I cooked some bacon in this pot, and then 10 hours later, I boiled some water in this pot.
Great. Okay, thank you. Yes. Then yes, within that period you boiled some hot water in the pot. It's considered a bat yoma pot. Why? Because the tam iser, which is still in there, has expelled itself into that water, and there was not shishim to nullify it. And debekula misharinan, everything goes into the accounting, and it becomes a bat yoma, and we need an additional 24 hours after the heating of that water. Lachar chimum hamayim babasar b'chalav.
Right. So
And that's where I stopped.
that's the pause, right? That
Thank you.
you would
Okay.
need for it to be tam nifgam. It would need to be 24 hours since the water was heated in that iser pot. But b'basar b'chalav eino kain.
Babasar b'chalav eino ken she'im bishlu ba basar ubetoch me'ed le'ed huchmu ba mayim ve'achar sheshata me'ed le'ed lebishul habasar bashlu ba chalav mutar אף על פי שהוא בתוך מעת לעת לחימום המים. אף על גב דבשאר איסורים שבתורה איסור הבלוע בהתר.
Sorry, pause. We're gonna pause before the afal gav. So just up to the lechimum hamayim.
Okay, thank you. That's right. Okay, so when it comes to basar b'chalav, this is not the case, because if you cooked basar in this kedera, and then within that 24-hour period, you boiled some water, and then you cooked. There was a basar chalav came about. No, wait.
Right, that like I have a let's see. I have like a bisari pot. And 10 hours after I cook my stew, I heat up some water in it. And then 25 hours after I cooked my stew and 15 hours after I heated the water, I cook some milk in it. In that case, mutar, right? The milk is mutar.
Right. In that case, the milk is mutar, even though it happened within that 24. The heating of the water happened within that 24-hour period.
Right. Because here, right, we have again the notion, the logic of like the clash, the weakening of the flavor slash also the not bar not kind of logic that we'll see a lot, which applies when you have a currently permitted flavor, but not to Isser flavor, right? So when you have something that's already absorbed Isser flavor, we just say, oh, that goes into the water and gets reabsorbed as Isser into the pot. We don't say that like the not bar not, oh, it becomes like an irrelevant flavor by being diminished. It's still Isser. But when you just have Bisari flavor, which by itself is permissible, we, if anything, again, think that the heating of the water, if anything, weakens the Bisari flavor in the pot. It doesn't mean that the pot has a new absorbed, like new meat flavor, as if that was the time it was cooked. Right? So therefore, we only actually care about it being 24 hours from when the meat itself was cooked in the pot. Okay. We are going to pause here and come back in 5 minutes, and we'll resume with the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, let's come back. Right, we are picking up beginning of Shulchan Aruch, Sadi Daled. Okay. And let's see, most of us are back. But Josie, do you want to kick us off with Aleph in the Shulchan Aruch?
Absolutely. Hatohav kaf cholevet b'kedera shel basar, o ipacha, nisharin mechoma shenitchav mimenu b'kedera, av hakaf min yomo, tehainu sheshamashovo b'chli harishon. Toch me'eleit, ויש מי שאומר שאם הכף של מתכת נשארים בכולו, משום דחה מקצתו חם כולו, בסברה ראשונה עיקר וכן נוהגים. All right, so if you dip and stir with a spoon, a dairy spoon in a meaty pot, or vice versa, you measure against everything that you dipped with it in the pot, and presumably you're looking for shishim against this. If the spoon was ben yomo, I don't know if this is the Ramah here or if this is some.
Yeah, this is the Ramah.
This is all the Ramah here. Given that there's something there, Sheshamashogo, that you're using it.
Yeah, that somebody used it in a Kli Rishon.
In a Kli Rishon, Tochme within 24 hours. And there are those who say that if the spoon was made of metal, you measure against the entirety of the spoon, not just about the part that was dipped in, because of this principle of cham miktzatov ham kulo, that if you heat a little bit, you heat the whole thing. And the reason, and the first reason, is the basis, and that's how we posket, or that's how we act.
Right. So the Ramah makes it explicit that we don't hold like remaining parrots, and the Shulchan Aruch, though he doesn't explicitly say so, the general assumption is often that if he says something stam and the other, yesh mi she'omer, that we normally assume he is posketing like the first opinion. Okay, and let's look. Can you get the Shach Aleph? Misharim b'chol ma shenitzav. Are you in the Shirat Dvorah or Alatorah?
Did you say my name?
No, sorry, I was saying Josie, but
Okay.
I didn't realize it was still me. Sure, the shach up here. I actually have a tiny little rip in my page there, so I'm going to ask someone to fill in a word when I get to it. Once again, we don't know how much this spoon is going to exude. Siman Sif Hey, Iya Dinan Kama Bala. And see above in 98.5, if we actually know how much it absorbed. For example, if it was, I guess, a new spoon, then you know exactly how much stuff it could possibly have absorbed. The Katav Marshal, this is where it's ripped here for me. Something.
Maharshal, this is just like citing the Maharshal's
The Marshal, yeah.
Actually, I'm always forgetting what is the Aleph of Shem? The Isor v'Heter Shelo, right?
It's in, okay.
Its own Isor v'Heter is
Yeah,
fair.
yeah, there's a little. Okay, these are the Maharshal, the Perakid Anasha Siman Membeit, the Im Enu Barur Lo Ad Kama Tachav, and if it's not clear how much went in, Misha'arin Vestam Derech L'Chov, you measure by the just the way you normally stir with. Dehainu ad rosh hakaf ad kan. So basically, he's saying that somehow there's a standard measure of spoon that you would be dipping in your pot, and that is the measure we're going to use.
Right. But he's saying, like, we talked about not knowing how much it expels, but he's also like, you might not have been measuring the exact point on the spoon that it hit up to. But he's like, we assume basically the normal spoon part, that's not the handle, is what's is dipped into the dish. Which interestingly, I get there are some other commentators who suggest that actually you should measure against the entirety of what part of the spoon basically is below the lip of the pot, even if it's not in the tavshil, with the assumption being presumably that like the steam and all of that like is like conveying the flavor. But the shach here and some others seem to be specifically articulating that it's just what's in the tavshil, not what is in like the sort of pot's environs, as it were. Okay. So this is our first bit. We see minimally the Ramah, probably the Shulchan Aruch do not pass on the Gerber parrots. We go by the amount of the spoon that's been dipped in. So now, Shammai, can you read bet for us in the Shulchan Aruch?
Where?
Bet in the Shulchan Aruch.
אם תחב הכף בשדרה 2 פעמים, ולא נודע בינתיים, צריך 2 פעמים 60. Okay, so basically the same language of the Torah. If you didn't know that the first time the spoon was mixed into the pot, and then it was mixed, and then the spoon again was mixed into the pot, so you need twice shishim in order to nullify. And then the Rama adds, ויש אומרים, דסגי בפעם אחת 60 וכן נוהגים. So he disagrees and says that the minhag is that you don't need 120. Now 60 is enough.
Right. And that's what we do. So look at the shach on bet Sif Katan Dalid im tachav hakaf.
אם תחב הכף, הטעם, כתבו הגאון מרדכי דחולין ומהריל בתשובה סימן קס"א what's ת"ה ד'? Some other posek?
The Trumat Hadeshen.
Trumat Hadeshen, סימן קפ"ג. So he's quoting all these poskim. מתחילה צריך 60 נגד החלב, וחיישינן דילמה נשאר בו מעט חלב. וכשיוציאו מן הקדרה נעשה כל הכף נבלה מבשר בחלב. ולכך צריך לבטל הכף בפעם השני. So the first time the spoon was dipped, it still had enough to emit again in the second time. But since it was
a little bit of milk that stayed in it.
Yeah. So the bit of milk that stayed in it was now became basar b'chalav because it was dipped in a meat pot. And now when you're dipping it the second time, that's why you need twice bitul.
Right. The logic is like the first time, as Rabbi Joel was saying before, the first time you needed to nullify the milk. The second time you need to nullify the basar v'chalav that has become the spoon's emission. And also, again, the main logic for those who say you don't need to do it twice is the Ramban's position or the Ravan's position. Ravan? Rav Joel? Is that correct? Rav Nachum? Yeah. Or is it both?
I think it is the Ravan.
Okay, the Ravan's position that bli'ah, that absorbed flavor, cannot be naset nevela, that only applies to like physical things. And so that's sort of the kula for saying you don't need shtei pamim shishim is like they don't think they don't think it can become basar v'chalav in the spoon, right? But if you think it can, then that's why we need the second time. And now the shach also does a bit of a diuk from the language here. Nirad mehai tama.
ונראה, דמחי תמה כתב הטור, אם תחב 2 פעמים, צריך 2 פעמים 60. ולא כתבו סתם ואם תחב הרבה פעמים צריך 60 בכל פעם. So this is only applicable when it's the second time. Then you need 120 or twice 60. But if you do it again and again and again, you don't need each time, 180, 240, etc. משום זה, אז לטעמיו דסביר עלי, זה לא אמרינן חנן רק בבשר בחלב. לטעמה הוא מפני שכל אחד היתר בפני עצמו, ועל ידי חיבורה נאסרו, מה שאין כן בשאר איסורים. So the reason for that is because we don't say Hanan, we only say Hanan in Basar Bechalav. If we go according to that, so that's Rabbeinu Tam, or that's the other one? That's
Rabbeinu Ephraim.
That's Rabbeinu Ephraim, okay.
That's the normative, like, Sephardi position that the Torah and Shulchan Aruch go by.
Okay. So each time it was a heter, and only it was permissible, but only the combination caused it to be prohibited. But and that's not the case in other isurim. וכמה שכתב בסימן צדק ב' סימן קטן י' ואי כך כשתחבו פעם שנית תו ליקה למימר דין what's דנן? not חנן? what's דנן?
נעשה נבלה.
נעשית נבלה.
זה נעשה נבלה. כיוון שכבר נאסר הכף לא נעשית נבלה אחר כך. אפילו תחבו הרבה פעמים, סגי בשני פעמים 60. Okay, wait, so when you dip the spoon the second time, it's not like the idea of Hanan, because it already was prohibited. So it can't get the din of Hanan.
Right. So this is the difference. Like the Shulchan Aruch would say, okay, sure, the first time when there was just some milk absorbed in it and it then absorbed some meat, maybe if we say Blia can become Hanan, then it becomes Hanan. The whole thing becomes Asr because you have milk and meat absorbed. But then the Isser in it is Basar v'chalav. That's just Isser. And so if that gets dipped in again, and it's nullified by 120 parts in the big soup, right? The same concern, you might say, oh, well, perhaps not all of the basar v'chalav in the spoon was expelled into the pot, and so there's a little basar v'chalav that remains in the spoon, and then it'll absorb more of the pot's meat, and that meaty flavor will be all rendered basar v'chalav by the remaining basar v'chalav blia in the spoon. But he's saying, according to the Rabbeinu Ephraim position, we don't say that, right? This is the kind of confusing thing. Basar v'chalav, according to the Rabbeinu Ephraim position, when they're combined, they create, it can be saying naset nevela. But once you have the isser of basar v'chalav, it operates like shar isurim, right? So the isser of combined basar v'chalav, they would not say that could render the rest of the absorbed meat in the kaf to be all basar v'chalav, right? Therefore, according to that position, he's like, no, 2 times is the maximum amount of like nullification you could need, because once that spoon becomes basar v'chalav the first time, that's the only amount of basar v'chalav you're gonna get, right? It's not gonna keep multiplying if a little bit is left in the spoon, right? Whereas he goes on to say that according to like the Rabbeinu Tam position, according to the Shari Surim position, like he says, the Smak would seemingly think every time, right? If we do hold Hanan b'Shari Surim, then we should be worried every single time the spoon gets taken out that some basar v'chalav remained and it absorbed some more meat, and that meat became basar v'chalav, and now we need to nullify the whole spoon again. Um, but according to the Rabbeinu Ephraim position, the max you would need is 2 times nullification.
Okay.
Which, funnily enough, a lot of later folks are like, very few people paskin by the you would need it every single time because they're like, needing to do it twice is actually already a chumrah, right? Like we already see that there is a valid position that says you only need it once based off of like the question of whether bliya can be chanan. And so they're like, we don't need to stack chumrot, right? We don't need to say not only can the bliya become chanan, but we're going to make you nullify this spoon by like 480 or whatever, what have you. So they knock it down a little bit. Okay. So now we've had our nullification and we get into our questions of again the statuses of our different items when the spoon is dipped. So Max, do you want to read Gimel in the Shulchan Aruch?
Im yesh shishim levatel akaf, hakeder v'atav shel mutarim, אבל הכף אסורה, בין אם בשר בין אם חלב, לפי שהיא בלועה מבשר בחלב. ואפילו בדיעבד, אוסרס אם חזרו ותחבוה בין בבשר בין בחלב, כל זמן שהיא בת יומה. Okay, so if there's shishim against the kaf, then you can eat the food and the kedera doesn't need koshering, but the kaf is usher because it sort of gets to what we saw before. It absorbs basar b'chalav itself. And so if you then take that spoon and stick it into something else, as long within the 24-hour window of the spoon having gone in the original pot, it's going to make anything else usher. Because it's basar b'chalav going into whatever else it is that you're sticking in. V'im ein shishim hakol asor b'hana'ah, afil hakedera. But if there's no shishim in that original sticking of the spoon, everything is asur b'hana'ah. Ach muter latet lesocha peros otzonen kevan she'eno nehena migufa isur. But you can basically you can use it with fruit or for cereal or something because you're not that's not a violation of the, or it's not benefiting from the goof of basar b'chalav.
The absorbed basar v'chalav is not contributing to this at all.
Yeah.
There's another thing the Shach just points out that when it says this spoon, you can't use it with basar or chalav. He's like, in this case, you also actually can't use it with anything.
Anything,
right?
yeah.
Like he's like, if the kaf is ben yoma and the pot was ben yoma and there's like yeah, and there wasn't shishim, then it's not set nevela, right? You can't actually use it even for parav. We also see one note based off of the thing we saw about this notion of hana'ah. One thing folks talk about is the concept of throwing the value's worth of the pot into a river, like being able to benefit from the thing that was made, but having to throw the pot's worth into the river because that way you're not benefiting from the basar v'chalav pot, as it were. If it's like an Eino ben Yomo thing, which that's like a whole broader question. The question of what happens to an Eino ben Yomo basar v'chalav pot, like something that's cooked in it, right? That one position says, well, the basar v'chalav, the absorbed iser, is Eino ben Yomo. It's tam lifgam, and therefore it doesn't have the capacity to oser. And so if I cooked something in an Eino ben Yomo basar v'chalav pot, then that thing would be permitted because it only has tam lifgam. Whereas the other position says the pot has become asur b'hana, right? By the fact that it absorbed basar v'chalav, it's not that the thing absorbed in its walls has become asur b'hana so long as it's l'shevach. It's that the whole pot became asor b'hana'ah. And therefore, Eno ben yomo, according to that view, is irrelevant, right? Like the pot itself has become prohibited to benefit from, and that status doesn't just get removed from it unless it's koshered. Uh, and the Marshal also on our water point, he says maybe you can make like shampoo with some like, soapy stuff or things like that in there. But he's like anything that could be consumed is a problem, right? He has an issue if you just cook water in it. He's like, even if your intended purpose with the water is not to drink it, he feels like we should be more stringent around anything that like can fall within the category of ochel, and that only things that like definitionally are not within that category can we be unconcerned with. Okay. Max, do you want to also read Daled in the Shulchan Aruch?
Sure. Im ein hakaf ben yomo, hakadera v'hatzav shel mutarim, v'hakaf asor l'chadchila, bein im basar, bein im chalav. Mikol makom, b'diavad eina oseres, kivan shelo ha'isa bas yoma. So similar to the previous seif, that the in a case where the kaf has been used within 24 hours, the kaf is aser only lechatchila, or maybe did I say that wrong? If it hasn't been used for 24 hours, then it's only aser lechatchila. But if you b'diavad use it with something else, it doesn't transfer iser.
Right. That like lichatchila, you shouldn't use it, but ultimately, and again, this is the same note that the Beis Yosef made of like when it's saying b'diavad, it means b'diavad if you used it with the mean that you just stirred. But if you use it with the original balua thing, then it would be a problem because you now have ben yomo flavor of the thing you just stirred. Okay. We are going to dive in. We are not going to read the entirety. Sorry, we're going to read Hay, and then we're going to break down the Shach into some component parts. Kalev, can you read Hay for us in the Shulchan Aruch?
אם בישלו מים בגדרה חדשה ותכתבו בכף חולבת, ואחר כך חזרו ובישלו במים פעם אחת, ותכתבו בכף של בשר, ושתי החטפות היו בני יומן. בשום אחד מהפעמים לא היו במים 60. אסור להשתמש בקדרה, לא בשר ולא חלב, אבל שאר דברים מותר, למשל, מאחר שהייתה חדשה שלא בשלו בה מעולם. Okay, so if you cooked water in a new pot and then you stuck a spoon, a dairy spoon, and then afterwards you went back and cooked water again, and stuck a meat spoon into it, the two spoons would be ben yomo, as long as they are ben yomo. Then and let's see.
In each of these times, right? Each time that you dipped the spoon in.
Okay, then the water was not shishim against either of the spoons. It would be forbidden to use the pot, either for meat or for dairy. But you could use it for other things, to cook in it, because it was a new pot, and you hadn't cooked in it before.
Right. So he's saying, again, this is the situation that we saw the smock bring up, that new pot, cook water, dip, chalavi spoon, there isn't 60 times the spoon. Then a new set of water, dip, ben yomo bisari spoon, there isn't 60 times the spoon. The pot can only be used for parov. But now, what does the Rama say?
Mihu'im avar ubishal ba basar or chalav mutar. Dahavi notintam bar notintam. Kedera she bishlu ba yecharot or mayim. Tachvo ba chaf ben yomom. Lahagedera ino ba yoma or lehefef. Or sheyesh um, במאכל שישים כל שערי ונוהגים להחמיר לאוכל המאכל כמין הכלי שהוא בן יומם ולאסור הכלי שאינו בן יומם ואינו אלא חומרה בעלמא כי מדינה הכל שערים. Okay, so however, if you transgressed and you cooked meat or dairy in the pot, then it would be kosher because it is notin tam bar notin tam, and the kadera that you cooked in, and if you cooked in it vegetables or water, and then you stuck a benyomo spoon into it, um, and if the kadera is not benyomo, or if the opposite, the Chaf is not Ben Yomo and the Kederet is Ben Yomo, or um, if there's 60 times the food in it, then everything is permitted. But the custom is to be machmir on eating the food um, that is in the kli because it is Ben Yomo.
Or
Um,
like the type of kli that is ben yomo, right? If one of the kalim, like the bisari kli is ben yomo, the chalavi one is eno ben yomo, and I have par of food, they're like the practice would be that you should eat it with like only bisari kalim, ideally, right? And I say kalim because the Shas and the Taz get into this whole thing. They're like, it's not no hagin to only eat it, to not eat it like with dairy. That would just be the halacha. They're saying like no hagin that you should ideally only eat that food with like bisari kalim, if that was the like ben yomo kli. But it's totally kosher, right? There's no problem with our par food in this case.
and we forbid the kli that isn't Ben Yomo. Um, but this is just a chumrah um, uh, in these places.
Or ki midina, because according to the law, everything really should be permitted.
It's fine.
Right? So they're saying in this practice, again, like this is in contrast to a lot of the ones we've been talking about, where like I have a kli that I'm cooking meat in, and then I have my eno ben yomo halavi spoon or things like this. Here it's just like I have my ben yomo meat pot that I'm cooking veggies in, and my eno ben yomo halavi spoon. And so for various reasons, this is more lenient because again, we have more sort of notne tam going on, more distancing. And so he's saying the minhag, and a lot of people assume that this Eno ela chumra ba'alma is specifically referring to forbidding the kli, not necessarily to the rule about only eating it with the type of thing that was ben yomo, but prohibiting the kli that was Eno ben yomo, right? That absorbed ben yomo flavor. He's like, that's just a chumrah, right? My chalavi ben yomo, or sorry, my chalavi eno ben yomo spoon that was dipped into the veggies that are being cooked in a ben yomo meat pot. He's like, really, Iker Hadin, that spoon is okay. But our practice is that we don't use the spoon unless it's koshered. Okay. Questions on that before we dive into our page-long shach?
Why is it okay to eat the dish and not, but the spoon is still prohibited? That I don't understand.
Well, again, first of all, the Rama is saying that like it's just kind of a chumrah ba'alma to even prohibit the spoon. Well, that's my, can you think of like why wouldn't the dish be okay?
So no, why not? Why not apply that same chumrah to the food that touched that spoon?
Well, so I think this gets into some of the logic we'll see around like what do we see as being lichatchila best practice with like kalim that we continue to use versus food that is fundamentally in a b'diavad status of already having been cooked, right? That like obviously a lot of this depends on where we put the marker of b'diavad, but the fact of the matter is like the food, it's part of food that was cooked in a pot that had meat flavor. It's not even meat food. It absorbed flavor from the pot that absorbed it from meat and then gets ano ben yomo chalavi flavor that even if that food was meat, wouldn't render it prohibited. Right? Because we saw this too, that even if you have meat food, if an ano ben yomo chalavi spoon stirs it, that's tam lifgam. That doesn't become basar v'chalav. You shouldn't do it lechatchila, but like it would be fine. So kol shekain here in the case of the para food, that there's nothing that has the capacity to prohibit it, right? Like again, even if it were meat, it would be fine. Kol shekain that it's only being cooked in a meat pot. And it's just this chumrah that because this spoon has indirectly absorbed ben yomo meat flavor while also still having absorbed ano ben yomo milk flavor, that there's like this humor of saying, since both of those kind of exist in the spoon, even if in very kind of weak ways, the humor is to not use it unless you're going to kosher it. Because like the question is about like using the spoon going forward that has both of these things absorbed within it. But the question of eating this par of food now, they're like, yeah, this is completely b'diavad, right? Like the tam lifgam already happened. There's no actual isser that was produced in the food. And so they don't see a logic in prohibiting the food in that case.
So even those agreeing with this chumrah would say that if you keep using that spoon, it's okay. It doesn't usher the food that you're
right.
using it.
Certainly the Rama is saying like if you use that spoon again, the thing you used it with would not be prohibited. Right? That's why he says like Chomer ba'alma medina hakol shari. He's like, this is a chumrah, but truly, if you use this spoon, it would be okay. Okay. For the shach, Rav Joel, can I call on you to kick us off? Well, this is Tet Vav.
Yep. Im bishlu. Yeah, this is that's right. Where we are. This is עד סוף הסעיף, באמת המחבר לא כיוון יפה בכאן, וגם הרב לא ירד למכוון, לכן מוכרח אני להעריך. All right, so neither the Ramah, I got the wrong order, the Chaber and the Marav they weren't quite, not correct, they just kind of didn't get it right. Let's put it that way. That's maybe that's the something like that. So this is why the Shach is forced to say a lot about this. All right. Zilashon Smak. Maseba lifnei mori. All right, so the Smak says before I never remember who his teacher's actual name is, but his teacher has this masa. B'ktera charasha shebishlu b'mayim utkavol letocha kaf cholevet bat yoma. All right, so you've got a new kedera, and you're heating water in it, and you stick in a recently used milchik spoon. V'lo haya b'mayim kedei levatel. All right, and there's not 60-1 against the spoon. Ve'achar I have hayamim bishlu b'mayim acher. Is that right? Ve'achar yamim. Yeah.
Yeah.
It looks like a mistake.
Like after some days.
Yeah, it's a mistake. It's got to be ve'achar hamayim bishlu b'mayim acherim. I think, right? Something like that, right?
I don't think so, because I think it's that after, like there was a gap. Like
there's a gap.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Yeah. So maybe after some number of days, they cook other water in it. Utkavol tocha kaf shenishtamesh lebasar. Kimochen bat yoma. So now you cook water. Second time, you stick in a meat spoon. Okay. Same. V'gam ken lo yabamayim shishim kedei levatel. All right. So now you've got similar case. You've had milchik spoon in the pot with water, boiling water, and you've had meat spoon in the pot with boiling water, and both of them were ben yomo. There's no bitul. All right. So how does his teacher, the Smak's teacher, respond to this? V'horeh shenivla mipagam basar bechalav והקדרה אסור להשתמש בה בשר או חלב, אבל לבשל בה דגים מותרת. All right. So he says, I got to go back to read. So it's got pagum basar b'chalav in it, and therefore the kedera you can't use with basar or chalav, but you can use it with fish. So you can do it with parf. That's his way of saying parf. Okay. ומיהו נראה, כיוון שגדרה חדשה ולא בישלו בה חלב מעולם, right? אף אגב שתחבוא לתוכה כף חולבת, בת יומה, וגם אין בקדרה שישים, מכל מקום אין הקדרה נעשית חולבת, בהכי לאסור אם בישלו בה בשר אחר כך אפילו בו ביום, משום דאבי נותן טעם בר נותן טעם. All right. Hatam, I would say, I'll give the explanation of the not barnat in a second that he's going to give. So he says, it seems, however, that since it's a new pot and there was never any milk actually cooked in it, even though you put a milchik spoon in it, and you weren't able to do beetle on it, the pot doesn't really become a milchik pot, right? Such that if you actually cooked meat in it afterwards, even on the same day, it'd be problematic because it'd be what the flavor of the milk flavor in it is noten tam or noten tam, right? Hatam hayotze el hakaf, umin hakaf el hamayim shebekadera, umin hamayim el hakadera atzma, right? V'adayin hu heter, right? Because you have three steps. You have from the spoon to the water, from the water to the kedera, and it's still, everything is just milchik. It's all in heter at this point. So what's the problem? So umihai taima nami im leachar me'et le'et mitriva kaf cholevet huchmu ba'mayim. Oh, yes, it's got to be kama yamim. So, and if for the same reason, after 24 hours from that initial milchik spoon mixing, you now cook water in it and you stick in a meat spoon that's bat yoma. Mutar lishtamesh b'kedera lacharchila basar. Right, you can lechatchila use it with basar. Right, v'tam chalav shenivla b'kedera lo chashiv tam. Right, and the chalav that was in this is not considered anything. It's not considered tam. Kede pirashti. All right, like I explained. Ve'omnam emetu כאשר פסק הרב דקדרה בלוע מבשר וחלב, אפילו בבגם אסור להשתמש בה לכתחילה לא בשר ולא חלב, right? All right, but we have this. In truth, the psak of this is the Rama, I believe, right? That if you have a kedera that has basar and chalav balua in it, even though it's pagum, you can't use it.
I don't think this is the Rama. This is the smak talking about his Rav's psak.
Oh, you think it's still the smak here? Okay,
yeah, so we're gonna get to Agkan Lashono in a bit.
Yeah. So okay, still the smak. So even though he said that if you did have pagum basar b'chalav in a kedera, you can't use it lechatchila with basar chalav. Umashkachat lakagon kedera shel chalav shnishmesh b'chalav ba'ayin ve'achar me'et le'et nishmesh ba'basar. Habasar mutar v'kedera asur. This is lishmesh ba'lechatchila lo basar v'lo chalav. Right? Lefi shehi balua bipagam basar b'chalav ad kan lo shano. Right? That's even though in the case where if you cooked actual meat in it, did I get the order wrong? I might have. Right? If you have a kedera, you cooked a milchik pot that hasn't been used. You use real milk in it. You could see the milk, right? Not from like a spoon that went into the water, right? And then after 24 hours, you cooked basar in it. Even though the basar is mutar, that you can't use this kedera for either basar or chalav lechatchila, even though the flavor in it, the basar chalav mixture in it is pagum, right? At least one of the two flavors.
Can I just jump in here just to emphasize what you said,
yeah.
Which is that he's adding his point that the real reason you can't do it is because of the general gezerah of having separate pots and pans. In other words, you can't use every single, many fleshik pots aren't really fleshik because they're fleshik, but at the time it's pagum. But we still say you can't use it for chalav. So this pot is like a two-way pot. It's also fleshik and also milchik, and even though it's both pagum, it comes out that because of the gezerah, you can't use the pot for anything.
Right. But this is going to be the really crucial thing, and I'll summarize the next little bit in the shop, which is that he points out from this girsa of the smak it actually seems like what the Smak is saying is he first quotes his Rav's ruling, and then he disagrees with it, right? That his Rav seems to be the one who says, oh, you had the water, you put the chalavi spoon in, then you had other water, you put the bisari spoon in, and you can't use it for chalavu basar. And the Smak is saying, I actually think it should be totally fine to cook meat in that pot.
No, but then he
Like,
says, but actually, my
no,
Rav is right.
no, no. He says, I think my Rav is right in a different case. He says, I think my Rav is right if it's a pot that you cooked milk in, not a pot that you cooked water in and stuck a chalavi spoon in, right? So he ends up saying, if you cooked actual milk in a pot and then it becomes eno ben yomo, and then you cook meat, he's like, sure, in that case, I agree with my Rav that like basar v'chalav, that's like lifgam, it's still usher to use that pot until koshering it. Even though it's not proper basar v'chalav, it's still usher to use that pot. But he's saying that that applies when you absorb it from the actual meat and milk that's being cooked in the pot. But the Smak appears to be disagreeing with his Rav about the ruling when you have just a new pot that you cooked water in, stuck a milky spoon in, then later cooked water in and stuck a meaty spoon in. And he's saying that it actually seems like it should be fine to cook meat in that pot. That's how the Shach understands it. And quite frankly, I think does seem to be the shot of this girsa that we have in front of us of the Smak. If you disagree, feel free to voice it. But that is the Shach's understanding. And so if you skip down a little bit,
It all rests on the word mishkachat la. When he
Yeah.
says mishkachat
and
la,
also
is
also
that
the
the only
Mihunira.
case, or is that just another case, or is that the paradigmatic case which he's equating this case to? He says mishkachat la in the case that you described, where it's
Well, it
real
also
milk and meat.
rests,
And the question is what he means exactly by that.
but it also rests on the how the Mihunira is working. Like, what is it that he's
Yeah.
qualifying? So that's what, as we'll see later, the Shach thinks the Mechaber has a different girsa of. But so the Shach, if people go, again, we're going to skip a few lines. If you're in Alatorah, probably best to search these words. If you're on the Shirat Dvorah, it's like almost exactly halfway down the page. It's after a period. The line begins with Vahu Pashut, and it says, Ve'im kain yesh litmoa al hamachaber. Right? So it says, Ve'im kain yesh litmoa al hamachaber, lama asar levashal babasar. V'prat shehu matir lekaman rosh timan tzadihe, nat bar nat b'bishul. Right? There's knots bar knots going on here, right? There's many knot bar knots. You have the milk to the spoon to the water to the pot, and then also the meat to the spoon to the water to the pot. That's three notnei tam. And the Mechaber in, our next siman is like, yeah, not bar not is permissible. So why does he forbid cooking meat? Huh? He says, v'od, ועוד תמה, דהך כתב מאחר שהייתה חדשה וכולי, דמשמע האם בישל בה מתחילה חלב בעין, אסור לבשל בשאר דברים. וזה אינו למה שכתב לכמן סימן צדי סעיף ג' לכערות של בשר שהודחו ביורה חולבת, במים רותחין, אפילו שניהם בני אומן, הכל מותר מטעם דהבה נat bar nat. Right? This is also a fun dishwasher ruling that we'll see, is that the Mechaber is like, you got a big thing. You have different Ben Yomo meat and dairy pots, and they're all being washed with like hot water that's like kind of, splishing between them. He says it's fine. Those are like properly cholevet or bisari pots. And he says because of the way, again, that there's the flavor in the pots that then goes to the hot water that then sprinkles to the other pots. He says that's totally kosher, right? And so, again, here, even if the pot was initially properly chalavi, he's like, I don't get why it would suddenly be prohibited to cook either of those things. Right? Right. ואף אגב זה, הפרק נמי מתיר גבי הדחה, כשאחד מהם אינו בן יומו, מכל מקום, נקת חדשה, דקאי על המעשה שהיה שם. וכן כתב בסר בהתר, right? That like, also here, the Smak's teacher is just talking about the Maisa, right? Like there was an Eno Ben Yomo pot, right? But he's not saying that B'dafka you need one of them to be Eno Ben Yomo, right? ועוד תמה, כתב המחבר באורח חיים, ויש להגיל קודם שעה חמישית כדי שלא יצטרך לדקדק אם הכלי בן יומו או לאו, או אם יש 60 במים נגד הכלי המגעיל, עד כאן לשונו, that when you're koshering things for Pesach, it's better to kosher before the chametz iser kicks in, because you don't need to be careful about if the kli is ben yomo or eno ben yomo or any of these things. Alma de mitam nat bar nat, mutar afilu lechatchila, right? But actually, because of the different notne tam from, again, the chametz to this and this to that in the water, he's like, once there isn't an initial isser, right? In the case of chametz, which at the time you're koshering it is not usser if you do it before the 5th hour, it seems like with the multiple notne tam, we don't have to worry, right? And so he says here, mihu, like there's one thing, or alma mitam nat barnat, mutar afilu lechatchila, kama shekatav harosh, velo tali lo margish. Miuhar lo kashya, de lama lo yehem mutar levashel ba'afilu chalav. דכיוון דעל כל פנים צריך לקבוע תשמיש אחד בקדרה זו, אם כן יש לקבוע בה תשמיש בשר. במקום מקום יותר נשאר בטעם האחרון מן הראשון, וכן כתב בסר והתר שם בהדיה. So the Shach says the one thing he's okay with is the idea that in the case we mentioned of, again, new pot, water, milky spoon, other water, bisari spoon, he's like, I'm okay with saying that you shouldn't use it for either milk or meat, even though truly, he's like, Me'ikar Hadin, it should be fine to use either. Because in both cases, it only absorbed via nat bar nat, such that that pot really shouldn't be properly considered either chalavi or bisari, right? So he's like, really, Me'ikar Hadin, it should be fine to use it for anything. But he's like, it's fine to maybe only use it for meat because that's the latter flavor that it got. And so maybe that kind of resides in it a little bit more prominent, right? And he goes, if you go like 2 lines down, he says, Vadai hatam hachitama. The kevanta mitzchila haita beloa ba'ayin nishar ba'oto tam ikar. Mash ein ken hacha bikdera, the nishar tam acharon ikar, v'hakibla mishnehem b'shaveh nat bar nat. Right? That we saw, there's a difference in the rulings between when a pot initially absorbed actual milk, right? And then you had this indirect kind of meat, versus here, he's like, this pot didn't have a fixed identity at first, right? We say initially, if a pot was properly had milk or meat cooked in it, that's its original fixed identity. This pot was new, and it never got a proper fixed identity. So the Shach is like, here, it actually makes sense to say that the more recent spoon dip, as it were, is the one that we go after, right? And he goes on, quite frankly, his big answer to how the, Mechaber and the Ramah made such a big mistake is largely they had a different girsa. He's like, there are different girsa out of the smock out there, and the Mechaber must have been misled by this girsa, which admittedly is still not a great defense of them because, like, the logical issues remain. Right? Like, even if he's saying he was misled by the Smock's girsa, the Shach is still kind of wondering how they logically square this ruling with their rulings elsewhere about nats bar nats, right? That we'll even see also that in the case of nats bar nats, there are cases in which the Ashkenazi psak ends up being a bit more machmir, right? So our classic case is one with like fish, that Sha'alu b'ka'ara, and we'll see there's different understandings of that. The Sephardi understanding, the one that early Beit Yosef goes with, is one that's like it was cooked in a clean meat pot, and they say you can eat that with dairy. The Ramah ends up passing by the position that that's only when you put the fish on like a hot meat bowl, but that when it's actually properly cooked in the pan, that becomes like one flavor. That bisar flavor, like it's not considered to be sort of multiple transfers. But the Shach says, even according to that chumrah, that doesn't apply here. Because we have no physical ba'ayin thing being cooked there, right? You had the milky spoon and the spoon to the water and the water to the pot. There isn't like a physical thing being cooked together. So he says, even according to the more Chumrdik Ashkenazi position, we should not think that this milk and meat meaningfully resides in the pot at all. Because like this should be a paradigmatic case of not bar not. So ultimately, the Shach's conclusion is that like truly Me'eker Hadin, this pot's parv, right? This pot that never had anything else cooked in it, you just had the water, milky spoon, water, Bisari spoon. He says this pot truly, on a basic level, is parv. But Lamaisa, Lichatchila, if you like stuck the meat spoon in second, you should use it for meat because that's like its most recent association. And he's basically like, your pot should have an identity, right? Like he's like, we don't want to be so willy-nilly with our kalim. And so because of this notion that we want to kind of fix our kalim to a particular identity, he says like, Lamaisa, I think that moving forward, you should cook in it whatever the later spoon was. But like on a basic level, he's like, really, if it weren't for that consideration, you could cook either of those in it and it would be completely fine. Right? So it's very lengthy, and he's trying to understand how the Beis Yosef and the Ramah could come to such a conclusion that seems to pretty wildly contradict a lot of what they'll paskin in the next Siman. There are some people who try to defend them, but a lot of folks do end up agreeing with the Shach's critiques. So hope you enjoy the not bar not discussions. We will get to do so much more of them in the next 2 weeks.
Thank you.
You're continuing next week at the rest of the Siman, right?
I think Rev Joel is going to pick up next week.
Rev Joel's going to pick up. Okay.
I'll finish it up. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yes, everyone.
Shikoch.
Thank you.
Actually, I have 2 comments. One is, it's not the Ravan. I checked. It's the Ramban.
Okay, I think I saw Ravan somewhere and Ramban somewhere else, and I didn't know.
So if you look in Siman Tzadichet, it's the Ramban who holds that not that you don't say Hanan in Belua. Also, the Ran agrees with him. And the second comment I have is, I really appreciate your reading on of the Shach here, because I think now you convinced me that the Rebbe was actually right. The Rebbe of the Smak. Who's the Smak?
Mm-hmm.
That I like that. I like that shot better. I can explain why, but we don't have time now. But
feel free to type it up.
Okay.
I honestly find I find the Shach very compelling. I think he makes a good argument. But I'm interested.
No, he does. He does. No, I'll just say one point, that the fish is not a valid contrast. It actually is a comparison, because the fish was not the problem. It was the flavor in the fish. So what's the difference whether it's a spoon with the flavor in it or a fish with the flavor in it? It's not the fish that's imparting flavor. It's the balua of the meat in the fish. And if we're going to be machmir on that, why not be machmir on a spoon?
But this is the difference, right? The only time there's more distancing in the case of the spoon, right? With the fish, we say, especially if you go by the Ashkenazi psak, we're even more kind of concerned because they say that when you cook the actual physical thing together, like in the pot, it's as if the fish has the same status as that pot. So the fish, there's just the one noten tam of like meat to fish, and then the second from fish to kutach. And that's only 2 notne tam, right? But in this case, you have milk to spoon, that's 1. Spoon to water, that's not considered, because the spoon and the water are not the things that are actually cooking together. It's like dipped in that. That's not considered to become like one.
You didn't cook the fish. You didn't cook the fish in the meat. You put the hot fish on the plate, whatever.
Yes, but the difference is that there's more distance there. You put like the idea is that the fish being cooked in this pan, like basically it assumes the status of the pan because the pan is the item that's cooking it.
Okay.
Whereas here,
you can say that. That's the
spoon and the water. The spoon and the water, neither of those is the thing that's properly cooking the other. So that's considered you have the milk to the spoon to the water, and then the water to the pot. So you have an additional.
You don't have the water here. With the fish, you don't have water. No, but exactly. The chumrah is that even if you cook with water, whatever. Okay, I don't want to debate it right now, but
we'll get into that with the Ramah. He actually, I think this is in the Dark Emotion.
We'll get to more in the weeks to come.
Yeah, in the weeks to come. Okay, shkoyach. Very nice.
Shikoch.